Right, well, it falls on me to introduce our keynote speaker, Peli Grietzer. Before that, I'm just going to be quite self-indulgent, because why not? I'm here. I've been thinking about, well, someone who hasn't been mentioned yet today, and I'm very happy to be on brand for me and mention him, if Wordsworth. And in the prelude, in the Cambridge book, the Residence of Cambridge book, he gives, which I recommend, is very funny. He gives a typology, like a taxonomy of his peers, like the people he encounters, which is, I think, loyal students faithful to their books, half and half idlers, hardy recusants, and honest dunces. And I feel like I felt like all of the, I mean, tag yourselves. I feel like I felt like all of those at some point today. I think when we were listening to Sean Bonney's poetry, I felt like a hardy recusant. When we were learning about Kamal Brathwaite, I felt like an honest dunce, but in a good way. Yeah, maybe honest dunce is the way to hardy recusant. And I'm sure during Peli's talk, once again, I will feel like all of those things, which is actually quite nice, I think, in this kind of setting. So Peli did his PhD at Harvard Comp Lit department under the advisorship of the Hebrew University mathematician Tomer Schlank. His work borrows mathematical ideas from machine learning theory to think through the ontology of ambient phenomena like moods, vibes, styles, cultural logics, and structures of feeling. He's an on and off contributor to the experimental literature collective Gauss PDF, and I really recommend the book that Peli published with Gauss PDF. It's very good. He's an occasional curator and dramaturg. He's currently working with the artist Tzion Abraham Hazan on his first feature film. And at the moment, he's busy reworking his sometimes technical research into a nonfiction book under the title Big Mood, a Transcendental-Computational Essay on Art. And that material will form the basis of this talk. And with one last indulgence, I remember in my first year of undergraduate sitting on the river down there at King's, reading, like I'd printed out Peli's PhD thesis and reading it and just putting lots of question marks in the margin. And so it's quite amazing now, what is it, like 4 years, so old, 4 years later to be able to invite Peli to Cambridge to talk about this research. It's a really extraordinary opportunity, and I'm really, really glad that we've managed to pull it off. So thank you for being here. Thank you, Peli.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks so much, and thanks for having me. So I'm going to be giving a little bit of context before diving in. So yeah, I've been, working for the past over a decade now, together with, I guess, like a motley crew of like friends and advisors from, philosophy, mathematics, literature, of course, computer science, and anthropology. I'm trying to use certain like mathematical and mathematical empirical, perhaps one should say, since the field is not quite mathematically rigorous, ideas from neural networks-based machine learning to formalize a kind of epistemic or cognitive concept that I call ambient meaning or knowledge of ambient structure or ambient insight. This is a concept that I originally developed. I was like trying to cope with sort of like the riddle of, well, what is modern avant-garde literature even like about? Many of us, when reading whether it's like Eliot or like Gertrude Stein, we feel like we're like learning something about something, but then when we're faced with the test of saying, well, what have we learned and about what? It's not so easy. For a second. So I found myself like, trying to seek a sort of like solution or point of like access to the problem, or trying to see what kinds of knowing or of understanding that seem to diverge fairly strongly from a kind of like standard, like, propositional model. And what you learn is like a bunch of like propositions about some like object. can be found not necessarily in poetic or like literary philosophical thought, but in more like technical fields. I had like a strong sense that the sort of like a post Bertrand Russell-y understanding of what objects of knowledge consist in perhaps doesn't merely like fail to be exhaustive of knowledge and understanding as we think of them in the literary humanities and in the arts, but may actually not be exhaustive of knowledge and understanding as we encounter them and trying to deal with them in fields like computational cognitive science and machine learning, fields that deal with what we might think of as the material infrastructure of our epistemic and semantic lives, if perhaps they're not deal with like epistemic and semantic concepts themselves. And as I was like working on these like themes, I actually also found myself becoming more and more sympathetic to certain tropes and themes to do with radical ambient, ethereal, ineffable forms of knowledge that are in common trafficking, in critical theory and in 20th century contemporary philosophy. They have to say I was somewhat suspicious of or like hostile to. At the beginning, I came to my work from the point of view of someone who's extremely devoted to avant-garde and experimental literature, but also like sits squarely within kind of like analytic tradition in philosophy. So one really interesting experience for me actually was sort of like suddenly, discovering like Adorno and like Sylvia Wynter and finding like, oh, actually there are like bits of like Heidegger that are like, quite good. Actually through actually developing an interest like in machine learning and suddenly having the experience of like, oh, wait, like this like little bit about like how like neural networks sort of like reach like that kind of like equilibrium and fed with this and that kind of like data that sort of like makes me like we call this like Heidegger thing at the encounter and in like graduate school and didn't really like much or pay much attention to, and now it's sort of like starting to like feel like something. So in the book project that I'm working on now, which is it's not an academic book, it's sort of like borders on being a general audience book. I'm trying to introduce the same technical themes about a neural networks inspired formal model of ambient knowledge or ambient meaning or like insight into ambient structures from a somewhat different angle than the sort of avant-garde literature by way of critical theory and Marxist theory and so forth, which kind of like informed my dissertation. In the book project, I'm trying to build up to this formal model through trying to show that sort of like emerges as kind of like necessary material engine or foundation for what we might call like the basic romantic picture of poetry as world making, or the basic like romantic picture of poetry as a kind of sustaining force of the relationship between mind and world, and the ability of the mind to hold together and the ability of the world to hold together and the ability of the mind and the world to hold to each other. And when I said this is like a basic romantic picture, hopefully I mean it's both in sort of like the pejorative sense of basic and in the functional sense of like basic. It's a basic romantic picture in as much as, so much, think of like the work we've like heard like today, obviously has to do with like thinkers and like writers who are like working against the grain of this picture, or from a position of demystification toward this picture in various like ways. So like the romantic picture is like Keats aside, the romantic picture is so relentlessly affirmative and constructive, and so much of like critical humanitarian thought is, as you would some from the word critical, you know, about deconstruction or resistance and so forth. So, but I hope that like aside from being like basic in the sense of like, you know, being like a picture that we are now, you know, ambivalently disposed towards, it's also like a picture that's basic in a functional sense, in that that this picture, that the capacity of this picture to actually grab onto something concrete in how things materially like work, or use the phrase that I keep going to, the degree to which this picture manages to actually track something in the causal material infrastructure of our like semantic and epistemic lives, I think does sort of give the stakes to so much of the kind of, you know, critical humanities work that we do now. That is to say, I think that if the romantics were onto nothing, then much of what we're like doing in the critical humanities is sort of like not going to be making much contact with anything like at all, and sort of, you know, even though so much of like what we do is in complicated opposition to this romantic heritage, if this romantic heritage is just sort of like wholesale misconceived, then, well, what are we doing here really? Trying to hit a stake? No, not that much. So I'm going to be reading from a book, and I think I'm going to be alternating between like reading and then stopping to just like chat a bit. You know, we can also like integrate, you know, a couple of questions each time like I stop to chat, rather than have all of the questions just at the end. So it's not just like a huge block of text. So the second best philosopher to die for drinking poison, I'm referencing Wilfrid Sellars, the wonderful like American sort of like analytic neo-Kantian, quasi-Hegelian, pragmatist, scientific like realist who you know, went to a somewhat early grave from overdrinking. So the second best philosopher to die from drinking poison said we have two images of ourselves. The first is the manifest image, where we're something like what court proceedings in a liberal democracy must take us for. You know, according to the manifest image, we act, we reason, we fail to reason, we fail to act, we form habits, we speak our mind, we lie, we speak sense, we speak nonsense, we know ourselves a little or a lot. We learn rules, we make judgments, we understand statements or fail to understand statements. The second image is the scientific image. In the scientific image, we are whatever can explain why the manifest image even works. You know, we are the secrets of how networks, electrochemical pulsations can make an animal whose world-making, life-making, meaning-making games will halfway hold together. Right, so saying that, you know, we have like the manifest image, which is sort of like, you know, the world defined by like personal, semantic, and intentional entities. And then we have the scientific image, which is concerned with the patterns or structures or laws or like mechanisms that account for the capacity of the concept of the manifest image to successfully function and hold together and let us lead this sort of like lives of normatively loaded practices and, to use our like favorite expression throughout this day, language games. Now, is that all there is? That is to say, are the manifest image and scientific image all there is? Not exactly. You know, we still have religion, magic, Zen, Confucianism, being with a capital B, and 10,000 other things. But it might be all that we're coming to. That is to say, the manifest and scientific image form a self-sufficient, self-stabilizing engine of modernity. Science constructs itself out of manifest image rationality, and in exchange, science promises to slowly, carefully interpret or remake manifest image rationality, while every other dream or image of who we are becomes grist for the social and neural sciences. This is say, so like, the scientific image is, strictly speaking, out to kill every other image of ourselves, but the manifest image is what science will kill softly or kill never. Okay, so then there's poetry. Not poems necessarily, but the world image born of art's resentment over getting cut out of the deal, to say, getting cut off the deal between, the manifest image and the scientific image. Poetry, as we'll have it in a slightly whimsical way, was invented when Percy Bysshe Shelley couldn't shake a friend's half-joking argument about the uselessness of poets in an age of scientists and statesmen. Excited to a sacred rage, as he put it, Shelley proposed a radical new theory about the human animal's capacity to build sustainable worlds, lives, and meanings. The theory is this: we have, for all the defects in our nature, a very good ear for what clicks. The selves, ideas, relationships, cultures, and sciences that we build hold by a kind of clicking of mind, language, and nature. There's an onto somethingness, a resonance, a pleasurable hint of unspeakable coherence that we know how to sense and how to hold on to and how to build around. Art, and poetry especially, is partial speech of this unspeakable coherence in the Shelleyan image. Shelley was mostly synthesizing themes from second-hand German Romantic thought and from Plato, but he was also radically transforming these themes into a program for an atheistic, proto-socialist romantic future, and never more so maybe, and never with greater impact than in calling the unspeakable coherence that hold our lives together itself poetry. Poetry, the Shelleyan world-making force, has no gods, no masters, no Platonic realm of forms, no natural teleology. It has only the cyclic poem of human world-making. Poetry is poetry all the way down, all the way up. It's a thoroughly secularized account of life as sacred mystery. One is ready to maybe hold up to the scientific rigors of modernity and to rise with human right and human gain. Now, Shelley did not, and thank God, sound like this. He wrote instead that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. They are the root and blossom of modernity. They are the prophets of worlds to come. They are the faculty that grasps the integral relationships of nature's forms. They are the mirrors of gigantic shadow that futurity casts in the present. They are the live metaphor that draws the good and true from the confusions of religion. Shelley wrote that poetry is the excitation that first woke the mind to natural science and to social reason. And it is the excitation that will wake science and reason from their calculated slumber. Poetry is a romance of the future. Now we're back to my phrase, it's no longer Shelley's. Poetry is a kind of romance of the future. It's a kind of bootleg modernity constructed from reclaimed scraps of theosophy, delirium, and myth, grafted to roughshod Kantian psychology. It is, all in all, another Shelley graveyard golem brought to life with speculative German science to hunt our dreams. So it's a bit of a family business in the Shelley household. So I just had to make sure everybody got the funky joke. This book is a defense of poetry. At its most narrow, this book constructs a mathematical interpretation of a kind of high romantic theory of art. The high romantic theory of art states that the work of a poet, and by poet here I mean novelist, musician, filmmaker, sculptor, whatever, can embody an ineffable truth where the feeling of a living subject and a pure aesthetic form and the objective structure of a world converge. I'm going to repeat this list. There are three things that are going to be, that I think, have to converge according to this high romantic theory of art is the feeling of a living subject, a pure aesthetic form that sort of speaks only for it in itself, and the objective structure of the world, or at least of a world. At its most broad, this book will try to argue that a mathematical account of this high romantic theory of art can get us pretty close to poetry in the mad Shelley sense, and it can give poetry in the mad Shelley sense. You know, poetry is like the world-making, the life-giving force, kind of desperately needed foothold somewhere in between the manifest image and the scientific image. And, you know, like every apologia, this book is also a call to crisis. You know, not in the defense of something, one also claims that the defense is like needed, which often is strange news for the people who have been like peacefully doing the thing. So here's my call to crisis. I said our like need for like a foothold for poetry in between the manifest and scientific images is desperate because without the convictions of a Shelley, our devotion to the arts, not only to the arts, but also to essayistic and poetic criticism of the social world, and even to the sort of like classical, like Socratic work of the examined life, becomes a kind of hobby or religion. Our best and happiest world-making, life-making, meaning-making games are currently running out of oxygen in the tightening circle of the manifest and scientific images, or else, I think actually much more commonly, they respond to this like tightening circle by turning to like dogmatism, occultism, and nostalgia. Now, you know, not everybody is going to have like a problem with this. You know, this crisis can and won't be everyone's crisis. A hobby or a religion is, after all, the heart of a heartless world. Still, and this is really where I think I'm starting, it's like, you know, still like a lot of us don't talk like we're whiling away the hours in complex social coordination games around the raw psychology of meaningfulness feelings. You know, we don't claim to just be trafficking in meaningfulness feelings. We're like hoping to be trafficking in things that are actually meaningful. And, you know, my sort of like position is that there is a burden of proof here that we're not necessarily automatically meeting as a practitioner of like the arts and humanities, or at least as of like intellectual spokespeople for the arts and humanities. So the way I put it in the book a little more bitchily is like, you know, and like if we mean to keep petitioning a citizenry for financial support, or, you know, if we mean to convince our comrades in the post-apocalyptic commune to cover our shift so we can write, whatever, it might be right to ask ourselves, you know, for how much like longer we'll be able to like make our case. Okay, so having said that we're on the road to hell, this book will argue that the better path starts with a U-turn. And that there's like a world to win by going back to the Romantic Revolution and to its roots in Kantian philosophy, and then following the trajectory of Kantian philosophy to computational cognitive science. Okay, so we're going to have our first little chatty break here. I should say that my reading of Shelley above, I think, is like, this is like very informed by like Sylvia Winter's work on sort of like, you know, poetry as the primary sort of like engine through which like man is like, as he comes to see himself like as man sort of like enacts worlds into being. And of course, for like, you know, for Sylvia Winter, like this like first moment, while gendered in a way that ultimately has to be like overcome, and that's why, you know, it's a man and like a he. This first moment also sort of like does stand for like our first like ascendance from like the realm of like mere nature to the realm of becoming like semiotic like animals. And then she hopes that, well, maybe one day there will be like another moment in which we'll ascend from being like merely responsive semiotic like animals to being sort of like rational semiotic like animals that can truly like grasp like what is like the space of like worlds that can be made and unmade, and develop a kind of, you know, deliberative like politics or morality of like trying to like decide, well, which worlds should we make. Also, in what will follow, which is going to be like diving to Kant. You know, my reading of Kant theory is going to be very influenced by Peter Wolfendale and by Adrian Piper. Does anybody want any questions or comments? Or yes?
Yeah, I was just wondering, in your kind of setting up of the stakes of this, how you quickly moved to saying that poetry in your framework is, you know, art, film, literature, etc., etc. Why, if that's the case, like why hold on to the word poetry, and what do you think, like what valence does that word give for your art?
Good question. I think, you know, one might say that it's simply like a legacy term, but there might be like more to it, right? Because like, of course, it used to be like the word like poetry stood, you know, for like all fiction, and I mean, it's, no, yeah, okay. I'm going to stand by saying like all fiction. I think that was like the crucial distinction for like, you know, many centuries. And then, you know, like around like the time of like Shelley, poetry was like expanded. I guess in a strange way, just as it was sort of like, you know, as the separation between like, you know, poetry and sort of like prose fiction was starting to like emerge. At the same time, the concept of like poetry was expanded by the Romantics to refer sort of like, you know, but Shelley says like, well, not only are like, you know, like sculptors, dancers, musicians, like also poets, also, you know, sort of like the great philosophers, the great sort of like legislators, by which Shelley means sort of like the great sort of like givers of like moral maxims and like political exemplars, you know, they're like also like poets, you know, the great scientists, you know, also like poets. I think I use the word poetry because that synecdoche was maybe crucial is a strong sense, because maybe they could have done it without it, but the synecdoche was like quite central to the romantic moment that I'm like talking about. And also, you know, we still use this like synecdoche, right? You know, when like a movie hits like a particular level of like artsiness, we say like, oh, it's a very like poetic like film. You know, I don't know, like random station when Salinger died, people say like, oh, Salinger was like the great poet of New York. You know, like Salinger didn't like write like poetry, but you say he was like the poet of like New York life. That synecdoche seems to still be doing some kind of work for us, and it seems to me that it like that we seem to be written for the synecdoche specifically. We want to be talking about the capacity of art to world make. This is like the capacity of like art to demonstrate / create a kind of coherence in some field of cultural material phenomena, or like ways of like being. Feel like whenever sort of like a work of art seems to be really hit hard, like go for it in that particular respect, we sort of like reach for the term poetry. That's a really good question. Yes.
In a sort of move towards, because I really love this claim of having to justify your position as a critic in the future as a poet, or just having to sort of like vouch for your usefulness or your like social good, especially in the post-apocalyptic moment, right? Which like leads to this like idea that I think is like prevalent in poetry at the moment is there a poetic vocation? Is there an academic vocation? Are we talking about vocations when we talk about creative production, right? And I wondered how you sort of engage with the idea of how poetry will reproduce itself once it loses definitive or an essential form. So can anything become poetry, or anything that the machine deems poetry can be deemed poetry, or are there sort of it's like essential or fixed details that it needs to embody, or like fixed qualities that it needs to embody? So
that's like really interesting. I don't think I have like a good response. So I guess let's put it in the sort of like more of a comment than a question thing. Not that this will how you deliver it. I just mean I'm going to turn it around as if it was more of a comment than a question, because it was a great comment. But I don't have like okay, I guess I should say that, like, you know, there's like an unwritten like chapter about sort of like the question of sort of like, you know, I am going to be like making the case for like a certain kind of objectivity of certain of like the epistemic functions of like poetry. It's say not that sort of like, you know, aesthetic like value judgment or you know, epistemic judgments of like, you know, intellectual like value type poetry are like per se objective, but that there is like, you know, a certain kind of computational like material. There are concrete computational material like achievements, you know, to be had in reading and writing poetry, sort of like in the same sense in which, like, you know, a lot about sort of like, you know, mathematical value, what math is good math and so forth, you know, obviously a lot of it is like, you know, subjective in the sense that it's like, you know, open to sort of like to debate and to fashion and to sort of like, you know, politics, both in the shallow and in the deep sense, you know, but mathematicians actually discover things, and sort of like our like estimation of their intellectual like achievements are like tied to the work that's being done in relation to those, I don't want to say concrete, but concrete is the right word, but to those objective structures. So sorry, I got lost a little bit, but I was trying to say that, like, I do sometimes worry that, like, in making the case for the objectivity of the patterns that we engage with in like poetry, I'm also sort of like hastening the death of our agency with regards to poetry, because it could be like, you know, if these like structures are sort of like the structures of poetry sort of like grabs onto or like makes like salient or makes it visible, are sort of like mathematically out there in some sort of like fairly robust sense. It seems like you might say that it's like, you know, going to be all the easier for like AIs to grab hold of them and sort of like, you know, display them for us without sort of like the special intimacy of like the poet with their world and with their like subject matter being necessary in order to bring the poetic insight from, like, you know, the chaos and like the madness. I think, yeah, there's some like beautiful like Amy Cesar like passage about, like, you know, like the poet sort of like walking into the primordial like chaos and like returning back with like knowledge. There's a question of like, well, you know, does sort of like an objectivity or like material objectivity of the kind of pattern that the poetry graphics in minutes we're going to like lose that, you know, sooner rather than like later. And I think it's like a difficult and kind of like scary question. And, you know, in sort of like the age of the age of the rise of like automation, there does seem to be sort of like, you know, the less of like contingent and incidental something is, seems like, well, all the quicker are we going to be to sort of like lose our sort of like special intimate agential like relation to it, if like automatic processes could just sort of like streamline access to this structure. A weird note, I think, that, like, in a weird way, even though that part of it is very like non-Shelleyan, non-romantic, it is, I think, not very far from how, you know, sort of like the high French symbolists understood like poetry. I think they understood it to be, you know, the poet becomes sort of like a vessel for, you know, the like primordial like ideas that are like fundamentally impersonal and have like very little to do with us, and what the poet produces is like very little to do with the poet. You know, it's the poet is just sort of like a part of sort of like a vaster sort of like mechanism that can channel these like impersonal structures and forces onto the page for us to observe. So I often wonder whether sort of like, you know, we might not end up with a kind of like high front symbolist sort of like fatalism about human agency rather than like a more like technocratic kind of fatalism about human agency. If sort of like AIs take over like a lot of like aesthetic production. Thanks for these very interesting questions. Time. Okay, I guess since we're incorporating questions into the real time, we're okay. Okay, so a bit of like a dive into Kant, and from there we're going to be gradually sort of like touching on the beginnings of like AI themes through kind of like rowdily techno-scientific interpretation of certain motifs in Kant. And we'll see where this takes us. So the roots of the world image we'll call poetry first become legible with weird historical abruptness in 18th century Germany. I should say actually that some like Renaissance like scholar friends actually said that there are like more antecedents of like 15th and 16th century astronomical discourse. There was a lot of sort of like thing about sort of like how like and the astronomical cosmos is sort of like full of like patterns, but these patterns are like ineffable or beyond what we can sort of like clearly think. And there's sort of like an analogy between the ineffability of astronomical patterns, I think also of like weather patterns in general, in clouds, and sort of like the ineffability or simultaneous ineffability and sort of like patternedness of poetry. So the abruptness is not as complete as they say, but anyway, the roots of the world image we call poetry first become legible with weird historical abruptness in 18th century Germany. Still high on Leibniz inventing the computer, German philosophy was looking to perfect our understanding of the world by making our thoughts more affable. That is, distilling our concepts as far as we can into explicit lists or recipes or rules. The prospect of perfection here was partly in precision and self-knowledge for their own sake, and partly in the promise that all concepts bottom out in absolute, like God or soul or cosmic logos. And you know, when we finally complete like the analysis and arrive at this absolute, this is when our thoughts achieve completeness. It's against this backdrop that we find the wonderful but half-forgotten Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten arguing in 1735 that not all thinking strives for affability. Poetry, Baumgarten said, is a special kind of thought that's patently not affable, but still perfect just the way it is. What makes poetry perfect for Baumgarten is that although poems cannot make our thoughts transparent the way that philosophy can, they can enlarge the scope of our thoughts to a point that reveals their fullest nature. So instead of sort of like completeness, we have scope and density. A poem or beautiful thinking, as Baumgarten would call it, is a network of interconnected images and feelings and apprehensions that achieves a kind of rational completeness through its density, diversity, and harmony. Baumgarten treats poetry was in many ways the first time anyone in Europe talked about poetry as ineffable. Until Baumgarten, the essential mark of poetry was that it's made up, and maybe secondarily that it's emotive or concrete, which is more of like, you know, the standard Platonic critic of poetry. Poetry has to do with stuff like, you know, measures of like the body and like worldly desire and so forth. But for Baumgarten, studying poetry demonstrated that anything that we can think explicitly, not just thinking about concrete objects, but also thinking about like patterns, comparisons, abstractions, expectations, generalizations, values, relations, all of the things we can think not just explicitly, but also ineffably. And, you know, for Baumgarten, sort of like the discovery that poetry shows that we can have all this sort of like, you know, very abstract, very structured, very like, you know, complex and relational thoughts in an ineffable rather than explicit form, called for the initiation of a new field of study for which Baumgarten coined the term like aesthetics. You know, aesthetics was coined by Baumgarten to mean the philosophy of sensate, i.e. imagistic, sensory, intuitive, ineffable cognition. Well, the possible applications of the new subfield were wide-ranging. In reality, Baumgarten mostly built a theory of the value and workings of good poetry. This is, initially like aesthetics is like a general theory of non-explicit, abstract and relational and structured thinking, but it did apply it mostly as like a theory of what makes poetry good. But still, it's important to remember that for all that aesthetics came to mean the study of beauty or like taste after Baumgarten, because of this connection, right? Baumgarten uses like theory to talk about what makes poetry good. For Baumgarten, good poetry was nothing but good thinking of a special kind, making aesthetics a subfield of like logic. Let's say like logic as conceived, sort of like in Aristotelian like mode, it was like the theory of like good argumentation and good like thinking and explicit reasoning. And for Baumgarten, then like aesthetics is the theory of good effective thinking in inexplicit, ineffable operations. Now, Baumgarten's theory of good poetry had a kind of absurd computer sciencey brilliance to it. And the theory is really just like one line, which is that like the principle is like good poetry is simply a large quantity of sensate thought. So for Baumgarten, like a poem is better or like a thought is more beautiful, just like the more fit there is, it's poetry is really just like a lot of thought. But the trick to this absurd sounding idea is that for Baumgarten, like for like basically all German thinkers after like Leibniz, also it's very, very true for Kant, there are no arbitrary aggregations. You can't think just a bunch of unrelated things. The only way that you can like think about several things at once is if these things are a unity in a manifold or like a harmony in diversity. So because of that, because you can just like think about many things or think of many thoughts at once if they're like unrelated, in order to think a lot, but all at once, we have to think associatively, subreferentially, vividly, temporally, spatially, emotionally, analogically, particularly, generally, recursively, anything and everything that keeps our thoughts interconnected in a living whole. It's like we have to use just like, I use like a bunch of like strategies to sort of like weave our thoughts like into each other such that they sort of like maintain the fabric of their unity and diversity. And then sort of just like, the more thoughts that they are, then sort of like, the grander the harmonic design. And, these interconnections themselves, the ones that we usually with the thought to each other, as we grasp them, they not only maintain the manifold, but they themselves enter into it as like ineffable thoughts of like relations. This is like the connections themselves between the thoughts are themselves ineffable thoughts, or they are themselves thought ineffably. And then we can connect the connections and so forth until we reach the fullness of beautiful thinking. And even our experience with the poem's beauty finally is the ineffable thought of the overall interconnection of the manifold. So for Baumgarten, thought coming to the thought of its own beauty, the moment in the thinking of the poem as a reader or a writer, where we experience the beauty of the thought manifold that we created, and we experience this beauty, the experience of the beauty itself is another thought within the thought manifold. It's a kind of like sensate QED, or a faculty of sensate reason recognizes the completeness of a thought. So the reason why I spent all this time on Baumgarten is because I think the Baumgartenian idea of this like alternative form of like rational completeness through density, scope, and harmony, and then the sort of like certificate of completeness that the thought of like the beauty of the thought itself infuses the thoughts with, like the beauty is sort of like the moment of saying, okay, we've now reached a kind of quantitative harmonious completeness, despite the fact that we didn't like finish like unpacking everything to the point where we reach like God or Logos or like Soul or like Cosmos. This is going to play a crucial role after like Kant comes into the picture and says that, oh, actually you can't really get like, God or like cosmic Logos or like Soul. I know if you want to get there, but you can't get there. So this Mongolian idea that a kind of rational completeness in a poem as a result of imagery was quickly popular with poets, but its time didn't fully come until the meteor of like Immanuel Kant's like critiques hit like the European ecosystem. Slightly crude metaphor, I apologize. Kant's critical philosophy both like forbade or rather like attested the impossibility of traditional rational completeness proper in very severe terms, and at the same time expressed certain warm feelings, if reserved ones, but still fairly warm feelings for poetic analogs to rational completeness. And I want to say that like there's certain warm feelings that Kant expresses towards poetry's attempt at like achieving its alternative form of rational completeness, compared with sort of like the scorn that he heaps on the attempt of like the metaphysics to take like the straight path to rational completeness, kind of opened up a crack in what turned out to be the floodgates of romanticism. Okay, wow, I'm really running out of time like crazy. Okay, so now we're getting to like slightly more technical part of like the text. Until now, it was a bunch of like storytelling and metaphors. Okay, so this is going to be kind of very opinionated, sort of like techno-scientifically inflected toward through certain central concepts like Kant that I think very crucially on like the idea of like poetry. Does anybody want to ask a question, or should we just let's get through it. Okay. So Kant's strict critiques. By the way, it's like this is not. I think this is working because this is not going to be like the transcendental deduction or any of like the parts of like Kant that hopefully everyone's like well familiar with. This is not going to be able to like Kant's argument for the like unassailable autonomy of the concepts of like the understanding, but rather Kant's discussion of what he calls like the regulative ideas of reason, certain like ideas of reason that we can never actually sort of like satisfy ourselves in saying, oh, this idea holds, the world is like that. But on the other hand, we're also like never permitted to say, well, we're not even going to try to see how the world could be like that, but rather we also like we must always try to sort of like, make the world hold up to these ideals, while knowing that like every instance in which we hope that our theory of the world makes line up with these like ideas is fallible. So this is like the regulative ideals of reason rather than like the constitutive concept of the understanding. Okay, so Kant's three critiques replace a great deal of metaphysics and theology with what Kant calls the regulative ideas of reason. Kant argues that key cosmological, religious, and spiritual concepts like the self, the unity of nature, the progress of history, common sense, or God are empty and unknowable, but indispensable. It's like we think we know these world-giving, life-giving, meaning-giving absolutes, self, God, progress of history, common sense. We think that we know them either by the immediacy of revelation or through the ascent of reason, but truly, these ideas are incomprehensible and possibly unreal. Nevertheless, despite their incomprehensibility and possible unrealness, they function as complex ideals of the integrity of nature, life, mind, and the social that ground the very possibility of thought and action. Properly understood, these metaphysical ideas are part assumption, part hope, and part method. And in so they give us, super sensible, is to say beyond the sensible, beyond the sensate, criteria of coherence for experience. It's these ideas of coherence giving in the strange form of false revelations of the absolute that guide us in the higher workaday functions of reason. Concretely, Kant said that we rely on the sort of modes of coherence we present with concepts like, self, God, soul, common sense, progress in history, rely on them to distinguish real from unreal and objective from subjective. We rely on them to construct theories. We rely on them to make inferences, to formulate practical maxims, and to calibrate the production and the applications of concepts. If we were ever to give up totally on these like ideals, these like methods, /assumptions, /heuristics, /hopes, we're going to just be letting life and mind collapse. Now, Kant still insists, for all of this demystification, that we have to formulate our ideas of coherence as concepts of transcendent objects. Kant says all this regulative work is best brought about solely and exclusively by a schema considered as if it were an actual being. For Kant, a life has to imitate the course of German metaphysics and posit the soul, logos, and God, though this time just as schemas for keeping itself together. Now, I want to say that one way to think about the world image that this book calls poetry is as it is that, in fact, what life worlds need is more like the coherence of a work of art, not Kant's strange pantomime of metaphysical ascent. A lot of it could be good to call something strange pantomime, not Kant's strange pantomime, if I could call something cruel pantomime, it would be even better. Not Kant's strange pantomime of metaphysical ascent, but the interconnectedness of Baumgarten's beautiful thinking. It's therefore interesting that Kant's own transcendental cognitive psychology, philosophies, and also Kant's philosophy of beauty, and also Kant's explicit rhapsodizing on the power of poetic genius to express reason's ideas, all seem to practically force this rebellion on us. So, Kant says, oh, we have to keep using this sort of like transcendent objects, but in this like strange constructed form, and we know you're only using it as a schema. But then many other things that Kant says about like poetry seem to sort of like attest to the preferability of seeking this alternative kind of completeness through poetry. And now, one might wonder, why is it like that Kant keeps like holding on to the idea that we have to like use these like fake objects? One reason might be that this kind of like subversive reading of Kant that says like, look, all these kind of considerations are right, but actually we should like ditch the fake transcendent objects and just do poetry. That quickly became a kind of default for the poet philosophers of the German Romantic movement, and the poet philosophers of the German Romantic movements were all, free thinkers, atheists, mystics, or Spinozists, which are, four things that Kant says in the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason that is like, trying to ruin, right? I'm writing to stop the free thinkers, the atheists, the mystics, and the Spinozists. So that might like possibly explain why Kant couldn't take this like turn. So like Baumgarten charmingly called the poetic faculty the analog of reason, or the reason below. Kant, not to be outdone, argued that the poetic faculty is the imagination's analog to the world-making, unimaginable thoughts of reason in particular. Just to say, reason receives certain thoughts that cannot be like imagined, they cannot be grasped through the senses or anything towards through the senses. And by contrast, the work of art, and most of all a poem, creates what we calls an aesthetic idea, and representation of the imagination, which prompts a wealth of thought to which no concept can be adequate and which no language can name. I'm going to repeat this because it's kind of like surprising that this is Kant. A lot of people, I think, don't really know about like this like side of like Kant. It doesn't only talk about like beauty as like a formal experience, but also specifically about the capacity of like poetry to create certain kind of like thought objects. So an aesthetic idea is a representation of the imagination which prompts a wealth of thought to which no concept can be adequate and which no language can name. And Kant observed this gives us a kind of symmetry between aesthetic ideas, the ideas created by poetry, and the unreachable ideas of like reason, like God and so on and so forth. Because it says like, the ideas like God and soul and self are ideas of like reason for which we can't imagine anything that's fitting. And the aesthetic ideas, the ones created by poetry, are certain like amalgamations of like, like feeling, perception, you know, intuition, inclination, language, you know, these are amalgams for which, you know, no concept can capture them and bind them back to sort of like the realm of like concepts, although they do have a relation to the realm of concept. They're made of sort of like the same fundamental structures that give rise to the conceptual world, yet they cannot be fully brought into it because they're like too rich and complex and sort of like loose. I'm going to see if I can skip anything. Okay, so poetry, Kant says, does work through concepts, you know, like builds on like a concept, either interesting regular empirical concepts like, you know, like envy or like death, or what it calls of like the concrete representations of like ideas of reasons. Is to say, you know, poem can't really work with the concept of God because that is impossible, but it can work with like, you know, certain sort of like symbols of like godly glory. And then he says like what poetry does, it doesn't simply display these concepts, but it sort of like works through this concept to construct a kind of assemblage of imaginative elements that express a concept's implications and affinities with other concepts, and it can open to the mind, sorry, it can open the mind to an immeasurable field of interrelated thoughts, each one concrete and worldly, held together by the grace of an unnameable pattern. So, you know, poetry really reaches into the ineffable that binds the mere words of a concept, be the concept God or envy or like dog, to its life in thought and feeling, you know. So one takes up like gets at like the material and cognitive conditions that make possible the life of a concept or of a family of concepts. Now, if this was all just like hocus pocus, would do well to hurry along to the impact that these matters had on the Romantics. Though I'm not sure if the Romantics or us would be worth the trouble in that case. But there's like a rich and I think mostly correct technical story in Kant that will help us understand certain crucial distinctions in AI. And so I think it's worth a moment of our time. Okay, let me like figure out like the time situation. We started fairly late, right?
Yeah, we can run over a little bit. And if we're incorporating questions in it.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Okay, so now I'm going to be like telling you like a little bit of like the Kantian concept of like a schema, specifically the Kantian concept of like an empirical schema, less fancy than some other things that go by the name Kantian concept of schema. And I'm going to go through it on a fairly technical level because I think that this will like let me describe my central like technical model, which is a type of like AI operation called autoencoding, without having to talk to you about like, you know, the computational structure of like neural networks. So I think like Kant is going to give us like a lot of the vocabulary that we need. Okay, so for Kant, most concepts are composed of a direct experience of pattern called a schema, and a kind of sentential, you know, linguistic representation of the pattern, which he calls like the rule of the concept or sometimes the concept itself. You know, so we have like a concept is a schema and a rule. Now, a concept schema is what makes the concept bear on the world of experience, which for Kant means something stronger than for most philosophers. A schema is a method for binding sensations into wholes coherent enough for the mind to hold together. You know, again, we get this like theme where for like, you know, German thinkers of like the 17th and 18th like century, you know, you can't hold together in mind like an arbitrary list of things. You can only hold something in the mind in a given instance if there is a structure and unity. And you know, that concept like has some like play in computer science and AI, you know, there's a sort of homograph of complexity that refers to the degree to which like a string of symbols or like a set of like elements can be compactly represented by like a rule, or the technical formulation usually can be like generated from like a short program rather than like a long program in a given reference programming language. And I think there are like very fruitful connections, between these two, between like the derivatives and computer scientists, to talk a lot about the cosmographic complexity of like various structures and concepts, and the sort of like 18th century German philosophical drive to like say that like, well, we can't be dealing with just like arbitrary like lists or assemblages. We can only think a multiplicity if there is also a unity in the multiplicity. Okay, so as we say, like a schema is a method for binding sensations into wholes coherent enough for the mind to hold together. And then like a rule is the interpretation of the schema as equivalent to some linguistic predicate, such that experiential relationships between schemas map to logical relationships between the associated like rules or like predicate, right? So Kantian image is kind of one where we like, we have like our like methods for taking the raw inputs like experience and like synthesizing them into structured phenomena, time sequences and spatial sequences that are connected by algorithmic or rule-bound relationships. And there are going to be all kinds of like complex like relationships between how we bind together between like our like rules for relating like cat instances to like one another, and like a rule for like relating like dog instances for like one another, and maybe we also have like a higher order like schemas that that like give us like the rules that we use, give us some foundational rules that we use to create the rules that we use to like synthesize like any mammal. This would be like the schema of like mammal as opposed to the schema of dog or of cat, and then sort of like the logical like relationship between concepts are going to be a kind of like linguistic or sentential formalization of this material or computational relationship between the schema. So the concept like dog, for instance, is a schema for experiencing dogs as dogs. That is a schema for translating certain blocks of spatiotemporal data into dogs. This schema for Kant is also at play when we imagine a dog or recall a dog from memory, and in fact works almost the same way in each case. For Kant, seeing is mostly memory, and memory is mostly imagination. To perceive a dog is to experience a complex space-time object that exceeds our current moment of sensation, so that, for example, to see a running dog, we basically have to make a dog. Our imagination has to synthesize what's in our memories, together with the color and shape content of our current visual sensation, into a four-dimensional image of a running dog. The real point, though, is that we clearly don't hold a literal comic strip about a running dog in our mind's eye, nor can we, like Alan Moore's Dr. Manhattan, experience countless moments all at once. Kant argues that instead, what we're experiencing in perception, memory, and imagination is something more abstract. We're experiencing the pattern dog, or rather the pattern running dog with brown fur, short tail, wet snout, which grasps the four-dimensional manifold with as much specificity as our mind can hold at once. And we combine it with our current moment of sensation, combine the pattern with our current moment of sensation, sort of like get this like reproduction of the raw sensorial inputs. Right, so the image one where like, we get raw sensorial inputs, but we, or rather our like bodies get raw sensorial inputs. We as minds can't grasp raw sensorial inputs because they're just like structural multiplicity as given. So now our like brains, which now are already like a little bit us for Kant, the work of synthesizing is sort of like on the border between being something that belongs to the mind and something that belongs like merely to the brain, is going to be looking for ways to like recreate this like sequence of like inputs using like a pattern or like a rule or like a structure, and then sort of like what like arrives to the mind is the pattern or like the rule itself, or rather, we experience the concrete like inputs only sort of like through the aspect of the pattern or like the rule. We can't just like grasp aggregate, we can only grasp the structures that bind the aggregates together. So, I'm going to skip a little bit and say that okay, now that the work, that's what Schema does, and then what concepts do is map all these like relationships to sentential relations, like so like we can map like the actual like relationships between schemas to sentences to rules that define concepts, like if X is a dog, then X is necessarily an animal, necessarily not a bird, and possibly short-tailed, and that's what like determines like the logical structure of the concept dog. And this is like based on or derived from the sort of like material cognitive like relationships between our schemas for like dogs and like birds, and our meta schema for like animal and so forth, in the way that they interact. Now, so Kant says that, Kant's critical philosophy famously argues that the structure of thought in itself gives us some of like the basic Lego pieces of experience, we get space, time, and like a reporter of like forms of unity. But the fact that these things should like add up to like a world, the fact that like, that we actually can sort of like put all our like different schemas together in a way that can like map to these logical and conceptual like relationships, as we can like describe what kind of things there could be in the world and how they relate to each other, and so forth, and that these descriptions then actually map onto material reality as we experience it, is a great mystery, and it's in a way like it's like the fundamental mystery of our existence. And this is where Kant brings in like the relative ideas of reason. The ideas of God, logos, and soul express our commitment to subsuming our sensory data in a complex and coherent world of patterns built in the imagination, is to say, only in as much as we sort of like believe in like God, logos, and soul, and then shall we say, only as much as we believe in poetry, or if we're going to be sort of like making the attempt to build a world of like schemas and concepts that adds up together. But building it in the imagination is like not enough. We also at the same time have to like hope that this imaginative world would hold up this future sensory data. We also need a kind of determination to pick ourselves up and try again when our like imaginative construction of the world and its relations does not hold up this future sensory data. Now, the great conservative romantic Martin Heidegger, like a bitter frenemy to the Promethean romanticism of this book, Jesus Christ. Like the thing that counts words and tell you how long it takes to read things out loud lied brutally to me. Acutely, so Heidegger points out that the concept-object form of Kant's ideas of reason makes them like very poor world makers. Kant, Heidegger says, falls back on beings like God, soul, and cosmic logos to explain the being of our life world. Our life world is way about it. Its mode of consistency, its vibe. And Heidegger says like what we need instead is an inquiry into being itself. We're going to keep with Heidegger a little bit in this, and we're also going to agree with Heidegger that the key to this kind of inquiry to the holding together of like the world, not as something that, the Heideggerian points of like, our determination to construct the world as an imagination in a way that holds together isn't like mediated by like belief in certain like, objects like God, soul, cosmic logos. Instead, it's like structured by our sort of like attunement to or like devotion to a certain way aboutness of things that we're like searching for or like holding on to, or sort of like attunement to a certain kind of like vibe. Where we're going to break with Heidegger is in saying that poetry as an imaginative grasping of a world's coherence, or as the expression of our of a kind of ideal of the world's coherence that we're going to be devoting ourselves to, is in some sense about the same thing as the scientific image. Haven't mentioned scientific image in a while, hopefully still remember what it is. This is to say that poetry, or determination to imagine the world in a way that holds together and to sort of rebuild our imagination of the world as it fails, is about the causal material patterns that make rational life possible, which is also the subject matter of the scientific image. Scientific images concerned with well, what causal material patterns and relations, be it neural, game theoretical, computational, anatomical, chemical, molecular, are at play in sort of holding the human animal together as an animal that can invent, sustain, and successfully play, language games and games of world making. And I'm going to be arguing further, against the Heideggerian spirit that the mathematical empirical field we call AI or deep neural networks give us some idea about the mathematical form of these patterns and about the mathematical form of imaginative grasping and about the resonance between the two. Okay, so let's take a hop and a skip into some of the ideas that the more substantial ideas I'll be suggesting. My basic contribution in this book is an account of how the aesthetic unity or vibe of an artistic work can grasp the causal material structure of a life world. I argue in the book that the cognitive content of a literary work lies partly in the kind of aesthetic vibe that we can sense when we consider all the myriad objects or phenomena that make up the imaginative landscape of the work as a kind of curated set. Obviously, it's only one thing we do when we engage with art, but in this picture that I'm working with, the idea is as we engage with a work of art, with all this strange linguistic streak and mischievous operations. Among other things that happen, a certain sort of landscape of imaginative entities, and by imaginative entities, that means any kind of sort of assemblage of sensations, memories, associations, cognitive dispositions, that can be an entity. So the idea is a work of art constructs a sort of panoply of those inner minds or to our minds, and I'm sorry for the Cartesianism of saying inner minds, and then we grasp a certain kind of vibe or unity in this sort of assemblage or plethora of imaginative things and stuff that the works of art lays out for us with mischievous operations, and we think of it as a kind of curated set where you say, well, there's something to the fact that these and only these things, or these kind of things, only these kinds of things are sort of being laid out. And the kind of unity, which I call the unity of the vibe of the elements laid out in the imaginative landscape of the work of art, is, I want to say, a major mode of the work of art's meaning. So for example, the meaning of Dante's Inferno lies in part in the je ne sais quoi that makes every soul, demon, and machine in Dante's vision of hell a good fit for Dante's vision of hell. I can find I could just not do the whole Wittgenstein part, which is plenty of anyway, so I can read it at normal pace again. So I argue basically that in many cases, if you think of this aesthetic unity, the aesthetic unity of the entities or things or stuff laid out in the imaginative assemblage fanning out from the work of art, as a kind of distillation of a looser, weaker unity among the objects or phenomena of a real world domain. So and this like model that kind of like toying with ideas like, like the work of art, the motifs that it lays out in imagination have like a very strong kind of like aesthetic unity, of the kind they call like a vibe unity. And this really, often, but not always, in some contexts, the kind of cognitive work that this unity does, it does by virtue of being kind of distillation of a weaker manifestation of a similar kind of unity in some real world domain, which can be like, social or like subjective, or it can also be like the unity of like a merely possible like world, or like a field of experience, or like a genre, or like a culture. The world is full of like assemblages, some of which have a certain kind of, German 18th century type unity and multiplicity that makes them like graspable as like assemblages. And the work of art, I want to say, presents like an assemblage that has like a particular like distilled form of this kind of unity. So I claim it by being a distillation of like a looser, weaker aesthetic unity among the objects of phenomena, among the objects or phenomena of a real world domain. The work of art can actually be like representing the structure of the real world domain. So the distilled vibe represents the weaker vibe, the real world domain, and through doing so, it represents like something structural about the real world domain. So the dense vibe of a work of art is, we might say, a blueprint for cognizing an endemic loose vibe in the world. And further, the alignment of the vibes acts as a kind of axis for projecting an artwork's internal logic onto the world, turning the sort of like structural grammar, sort of like the gestalt, systemic form, let's say something like systemic gestalt of a work of art into a kind of schema for interpreting the life world objects or phenomena. I'm gonna skip a little bit. Okay, so we can start introducing this construction in a more formal way with a kind of minimal technical gloss on Kant, or just like on our version of Kant. Perception, Kant says, is imaginative reproduction. To perceive is to rebuild a sequence of sensory inputs through a generative recipe, and so to grasp their unity in structure. This book argues that the vibe is something like the language these recipes are written in. We will soon make the relevant sense of language more precise, but the broad idea is something like a vibe happens when you like recipes for like a world's myriad objects or phenomena share certain computational resources and techniques. Okay, so like one handsome way to like illustrate this idea is to recall a type of mathematical visual art project from the heyday of 1990s hacker culture known as a 64K intro. So in the artistic mathematical subculture known as Demoscene, a 64K intro is a lush, vast, and nuanced visual world that fits into 64 kilobytes of memory or fewer. That's less memory by like 1,000-fold than what you standardly need to make like a nice little graphic. In a 64K intro, 100 or so lines of code create a centrally complicated universe by quite literally, and here I'm like appropriating a quote from the French Symbolist Manifesto, using the esoteric affinities of perceptible surfaces with primordial ideas. The code of the 64K intro uses the smallest possible inventory of initial schemata to generate the most diverse concreta. And the information theoretical magic behind the 64K intro is that, somewhat like a spatial fugue, the worlds that we create are tapestries of interrelated self-similar patterns that go like all the way from sort of like the topographical like level or topological level to the molecular level, a lot of like as above, so below kind of stuff going on. Sorry, so could I go for 10 more minutes? What are we thinking?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the story that my book tells about vibe focuses on a type of AI operation called autoencoding, where like a learning algorithm treats the world as a little bit akin to a 64K intro. To say an autoencoder is an algorithm, I'm going to be informally describing an autoencoder as an algorithm that treats the world a little bit as if the world was a 64K intro. An autoencoder is an artificial neural network tasked with learning to make facsimiles through a compression bottleneck. An autoencoder must translate each input in its training set into a short code, then approximately reconstruct the input from the code. So you fit in like a picture, the autoencoder has to translate this picture, which might represent as like a million pixels, into like a list of some, let's say like 100 integers, and then it needs to like retransform this is like 100 integers into like something that as closely as possible like approximates the original picture. And usually, fit it like several millions of pictures, and tell it like, well, train until like you know how to reconstruct them. Now, the point of autoencoding is for the neural network to learn how to leverage rich recursive patterns that holistically structure its training data, developing a kind of gestalt fluency that models its training set like a niche or a life world. The eventual outcome of this training process, the autoencoder model, learned by the autoencoding learning algorithm, is a kind of recipe book for the objects of the training domain. And if all goes well, these recipes act as intelligent representation of their objects and collectively make up a kind of map of the training domain. You can use sort of like a downstream like inference and search tasks, and you can use it to do sort of like, like a variety of kind of like quasi-cognitive operations on the objects. Now, needless to say, the real world isn't a 64K intro, so the short codes and autoencoder lines do not construct true recreations of their target objects. They instead construct idealized approximations, in effect replacing objects with their doppelgangers from an invented 64 intro-like menagerie of super compressible objects. It's this menagerie, mathematically speaking, the image of the trained autoencoder function. And in previous work, I referred to this menagerie as the canon, but people found it confusing. Just in case anybody who's listening on Zoom knows the previous work, I'm not calling it image. So, okay, this menagerie, mathematically speaking, the image of the trained autoencoder function, in its relationship to the autoencoder's model of its training set, makes autoencoder central to this book's account of vibe. Now I'm just going to stop reading and just like quickly rush over something. Basically, the idea is that by sampling from the reconstructions, you get sort of like a set of like objects that are perfectly compressible, rather than like approximately compressible as the objects of the real world that the autoencoder was like trained on. And then the interesting thing is that if you have like an untrained autoencoder, it wants to like learn the kind of compression schema, the kind of gestalt understanding that the autoencoder has of the data that the autoencoder was like trained on, then sampling from the reconstruction set, this is to say sampling from the set of objects that the autoencoder can reconstruct perfectly rather than approximately, which are of course not real objects, but objects made up by the autoencoder. You can learn the autoencoder's schema much more quickly than by sampling from the original training set. So I think that this is like analogous to the idea of like, well, you have like the original things in the world and their loose vibe, then you have like the idealized objects populating like the imaginary landscape of the work of art, and they're like distilled vibe. Those are the objects that can be sort of like perfectly reconstructed by the schema. And sort of like in a line, you might say that the idea is that you can efficiently learn a way of seeing by closely examining a set of objects. This way of seeing sees the best. So by examining the objects that a certain way of seeing sees most clearly, most fully, most lucidly, without like losing any raw information, or like putting like physical semantics terms, without like any loss of like materiality. There's no like material excess that's being lost. By looking at the objects for which a certain way of seeing has no like loss of material excess, you can like very quickly learn the way of seeing. That is, you need like far fewer samples. Okay, I'm going to say one last thing. So I'm going to say just like a quick thing about the role that I think this technical account can play in an account of sort of like, the Shelleyan idea of like poetry is like world making and life making. So a keen-eyed reader may suspect at this point that all the mathematized vibe talk in the world won't get us to Shelley's life-giving poetry, nor to our being as rational animals, nor to the triangle of the good, the beautiful, and the true. This is more or less by design, or at least by necessity. If poetry expresses the ineffable integrity that animates our thought and action at their best, then it's neither desirable nor possible to reduce its integrity to some kind of mathematical criterion. And furthermore, contemporary literary practice and poetically informed philosophy mostly rejects any stable coherence or integrity, ineffable as it may be, as a ground or ideal of human life. Instead, we're more likely to say today that poetry is a kind of infinite negotiation of the in/coherence, the coherence/incoherence of our self-transforming being in the world. So rather than trying to mathematize all of that, the purpose of this book is to mathematize something about the point where poetry makes contact with causal material reality. The work of poetry, I'd argue, is always amphibian, intermingling questions of causal material pattern with questions of existential value. Vibe, properly mathematized, is Janus face in just the right way to give poetry a foothold in the scientific image without cutting it off from its existential prerogatives. Last paragraph. A vibe, as we will have it, can mark either an empirical or an ideal structure, and in some sense always does a little bit of both. One way to say this is that existential ideals are partly vibes, and even vibe itself is a kind of ideal. What do I mean? First, that a value-giving way of life or culture or tradition, let's say Gothness or Confucian League or hip-hop or secular Jewish culture, consists partly in the vibe of the life world that it builds. Second, that vibe consistency is itself part of our idea of a meaningful life in general. To grasp a life world vibe-wise is to make it home. Philosophy, the 18th century poet philosopher Novalis said, is the urge to be at home everywhere. All this, the work of building like a way of life through the construction of a life world that has like a vibe, and the work of coming to be at home in some social material reality, or maybe some future possible social material reality, and by grasping it vibe-wise, all this requires a kind of hospitality from the causal material order. Ways of life are tenacious world makers, but they're not autarkies. Working our powers of interpretation, artifice, and agency on nature necessarily leaves room for resonance, discovery, and surprise, for delight in the life-world harmony, in the reciprocity of the real and the ideal, and therefore also room for desolation, incoherence, and collapse. Seen from the viewpoint of a way of life, the vibe coherence of its world is a kind of revelative idea, partly assumption, partly method, partly hope. Thank you so much for letting me go on for so long.
Thank you, Peli. Am I getting up now? Or are you
Well, I think we can have some questions.
Yeah.
If people need to head off to catch trains, then of course feel free. But I think we can have.
Yeah, maybe we'll have sort of like a politeness buffer, like everybody that wants to head out can head out without feeling like they have to squeak silently away, and then the people who want to stay can ask some questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for bearing with me and for inviting me and hosting me, and for being a great audience.
Does anyone have any questions?
Can somebody else moderate, or okay, I guess, yeah.
I would say pretty good. This sort of, my question is related to the last thing you said, which I think is, and you started with a sort of Silesian story that's kind of a Adorno Portman story as well, about the scientific image, killing other images, and you want to say that poetry is kind of outside of the scientific manifest. And I guess a worry would be that by providing an AI account of poetry, are you perhaps facilitating the killing of poetry by the scientific image? And that was when you spoke to.
Yes, I think it's related to right, no, sorry. Can you remind me your name?
Sorry?
Can you remind me your name? I think it's related to your question, right? Yeah.
Yes, I guess because you said you're providing a foothold in the scientific
right.
poetry, but you're not, I guess I wanted to hear you say why you're not quite necessarily facilitating that thing of
Right.
poetry and the scientific image.
So, I actually have a thing about this that's very cute. One second. So, okay. Back in the days before discourse of rationality and science ruled, we could perhaps hope to conclude that poetry is a kind of sacred mystery, that what we know and don't know about poetry is intertwined, that we are intimate with something in poetry's essence, even as it runs beyond our ken. That what we say of poetry, we wrestled into language from our inarticulate intimacy, and that we experience only part of poetry, grasp only part of that experience, and understand only part of what we grasped, but each part couldn't come from any other whole. So sorry, this needs like a little bit of context, which is like, I think that like, the issue with the scientific image is very much that it is not the manifest image. It is to say the scientific image has to be fundamentally alien and inaccessible to us, to our like intuitive faculty. I prefer the term to say that, we have no intimacy with it. And I would say that sort of like that there's this question of sort of like, okay, by placing poetry within or giving poetry a foothold in scientific image, aside from like the threat of sort of like automation, isn't this question of also like, what am I saying about like, how if I'm saying poetry is this like scientific object, then why should poetry be like anything like what we feel like it is and what we think that we know it like to be? And I want to like try to say that we can like that we have like a very important category in like olden times, like the idea of something as being like a sacred mystery, even the idea of something being a mystery at all, in the sort of mystery place sense is, something that we're like, that we're like intimate with without having like, full or like proper like knowledge or understanding of. And nevertheless, it seems like the idea is that like, what we don't know about the thing and could perhaps learn about the thing with like further exploration of a sort of like non-intuitive kind is going to turn out to have been sort of like a necessary condition for what we already experienced like intimately all along, and that in some way, mathematics, as many working mathematicians experience it, is a kind of like paradigm of it, where we think that like mathematical like idea, can sort of like go through this life cycle from like a dreamlike feeling to an intuition to a metaphor to an idea to a strategy to a proof, and in like the best case, you can go through this like entire cycle without losing its intimacy. It feels like an enrichment, and in the best case of like vindication of what was experienced in the sort of like dreamlike feeling stage, although of course like crystallized and sharpened. So I think that basically we have this like olden days concept of like mystery or like sacred mystery, very hard concept to like fit into any kind of like modern like view of life, but this concept in some way like survives in the idea of mathematical experience as it functions in the lives of like many working mathematicians. And perhaps we can sort of like understand poetic experience as a variety of mathematical experience, or mathematical experience as a variety of poetic experience, and sort of like in ways of like use that loophole to like negotiate how poetry can be something that is as we know it through our like intimacy with it, at the same time as being something that whose nature could only be understood or like known through a scientific or like logical kind of exploration. And in a way, I think this is like the entire like promise of poetry as Shelley conceived it. I did we can sort of like have sacred mystery, by which I mean, yeah, there's something being sort of like intimate and alien at the same time, without taking on like the metaphysical and religious like baggage or the occult baggage that's of like previous like iterations of like the idea of like sacred mystery brought with them. And this is currently in some sense like a good that like only mathematicians get to like enjoy. And I'm sort of like saying, well, you know, maybe we can sort of extend this like license into sort of like getting a taste of sacred mystery without like throwing like away your like scientific convictions for like a wider part of the human experience by like folding certain kinds of like poetic experience into that like, paradigm of like intimacy and alienation entwined in a sort of scientifically respectable context. Sorry for capitalizing on this question so much, but it feels like something, a place where I really wanted to go. Yes. Oh, and yes. And then
it's kind of a long question, so maybe you'll go first.
I'll go for, okay. I'll go for it. And if it's a concluding question, I'll say it's a concluding question.
Well, it's sort of like trying to, I guess, and this might be like my anxiety as a philosopher of science, but I was just thinking about whether your sort of like model of the divide has any sort of relation to sort of like causal theories of reference. And there I like particularly think about this like particular moment where like fictionalists and later like skeptics, the way that they engage with essentialism was through the fact that you could have these like reference points, right, where the sort of like essential properties came together with accidental properties. So, right, so if you want
yes,
to
it's 100%. It's funny. I even had like a tweet which was like a big part of like my deal is trying to see if we can sort of like replace the Aristotelian idea of like essence with the like with a kind of like late structuralist idea of like structure as interpreted through like AI and computer science, where I think we're sort of like the special thing that's sort of like the computer scientificized like thing can give us. It gives like some kind of actually like, you know, material hit to the idea of like the essential property, because if like in a sort of classical Aristotelian like, well, it's the essential property because we know through sort of like Thomist you know, faculty that is the essential property, kind of like structuralized and then like, you know, computer scientized account to say, well, it's the essential property in the sense that or it's like the essential structure in the sense that sort of like once you start like messing with this structure, a lot of the perceptible features will start to sort of like lose their like integrity in any kind of like dynamic or like over time framework. So basically, I think that the idea of structural integrity can do a lot of like the work that Aristotelian essences used to do, but it can do them in a way that perhaps can sort of like materially account for itself, because it has to do with like what the thing literally needs to like hold together over time. And that's of course it's of like, you know, there's a bit of like move through Hegel here, which is like, oh, there has to be a material kick to it and like has to do with speed over time, but then it's sort of like computerized. Thanks for the amazing question. Yes.
Yeah, so when you were talking about Kant, you were sort of focusing on the first critique and the third critique, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And I was kind of wondering what the position of practical philosophy would be in that, like the second.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that Kant only wrote 2 books. His book about like morality would have probably been great, but like unfortunately.
I think it's like an important point there.
So I'm just like I don't like the second critique, but I did read. So yeah, ask your question.
It's fine. If you want to talk about like replacing regulative ideas like God and nature and things like that, then the second critique sort of becomes important, because the idea of God is what provides the content for the postulates of practical philosophy and the second critique. But it's not just a technical point about Kant, because this idea of Novalis of being at home or this being in the world that Heidegger talks about, what in the later Heidegger would be something like dwelling. It's sort of intimately related to a practical philosophy. It's kind of an orientation in the world and an orientation in practice. And so I guess the question is, do you think that aesthetic ideas and a sort of aesthetic unity can provide this sort of at homeness and this feeling of practical orientation?
Yeah, so I think you know, there are 2 different ways I think to think about like the relation of like the aesthetic like grasping of sort of like the worldness of like a world, especially the world of like, you know, like a human-made like world, a world that we make through like practices, combined with like the hospitability of the causal material infrastructure to our like practices. And one would be, I guess, like, yeah, the very sort of like classic Shelleyan perspective where like you know, poet, like the aesthetic is like the first world making moment. It's what makes like the practical unit is like possible. There has to be a sort of like a moment of like aesthetic grasping before sort of like the practical fluency can follow. And the other, like, I think, like, approach, which I'm currently not immediately sure how I would like associate with, maybe like Collingwood or something, I don't know, would be like the idea that, like, you know, like, well, we already have like practical unities, but they're like unreflective. And what like the aesthetic does is it, like, you know, it makes the, you know, worldness of our like world making reflectably accessible and knowable to us, and also then like allows us to like engage in like transformative practices and practices of like critique and so forth. So like in terms of like, you know, whether one wants to say that like the moment of like the aesthetic like grasping of like the world making unity, or the unity that facilitates the possibility of like world making by unity, whether it has to come before the practical unity or only comes like a moment of reflection that allows for like its transformation, I really don't know, but I do want to say that I do think there's like at a technical level with the AI models that I'm working with. By working with, I mean theorizing with. I don't actually run computation. I don't do digital humanities. You know, so autoencoders are like not like the most powerful like models for like a lot of like purposes, but what they do actually give you is this sort of like, you know, representation of like a space of possibilities associated with like a certain data set as like a space of possibilities. There are like a lot more powerful, like, you know, GPT style like models, like, you know, autoregressive like transformers, they're called, which like they don't learn any kind of like global space. Like they don't, like, you know, if you turn on like millions of faces, they learn how to generate faces like really well. They also learn sort of like representations of faces that you can use to do downstream inference like very well, even better than like with autoencoders, sometimes much better. But they don't give you a kind of thing of like, okay, here's like the, you know, 50-dimensional space of like faces through abstractorism. You can like move around this like in this space and generate like new faces in relation to each other in terms of like how they relate to each other in this like abstracted like space of possibilities, and we can compare what's in this space with what's like outside this space. Those are things that you can't do with like autoregressive transformers, that they don't have this like, you know, holistic spatial representation. And I want to say that maybe this will like correspond a little bit to something like, you know, different between like vibes I talk about in something like a Bourdieusian habitus, which is like, you know, fundamentally a kind of like, you know, performance capacity rather than like a reflection capacity. You know, it's like both like ineffable and like implicit, as opposed to like a vibe which is like, you know, ineffable but explicit and self-representing. So I guess maybe my instinct would be to say that at least like on technical grounds, if the models that I'm familiar with are actually relevant to how like humans are like working, then I think that's sort of like practical unit, that unity is grasped in the ways necessary for like practical sustainability independently or before they are grasped in a way that allows for the representation of a unity and as a constrained space of possibility. The thing that allows for like, you know, reflection and critique and for like comparison and so forth. So I'd say on technical grounds, I'm leaning towards the idea that the aesthetic moments comes at dusk rather than at dawn. Yes.
I have a question about when you were describing like the aesthetic unity of like a work of art.
Yeah.
And you were talking about like the cognitive work that the unity of it is doing.
Yeah.
And kind of giving it like its own sort of subjective, like just in line with like what does the poem think? Like, but I was just wondering, like, is it that the unity is doing the work of cognition, or doesn't the subject have to do the work of producing the unity?
Yeah, so I, you know, in simplest French concept thinks you. Sorry, it's like American. What can I say is that like I often waffle in like weird ways in the writing, but whether like the autoencoding model is a model of the cognition that we're doing, or like a model of like the representational structure that we're like grasping through whatever cognition that we're, for whatever any cognition at all. Sometimes I feel like, well, I want to say that I'm like agnostic about how we actually cognize like a poem and whether the process is very autoencoder-like, but I want to say, well, the thing that we learn can be like well represented through sort of like the mathematical trope of like a well-trained autoencoder on like a relevant data distribution. And sometimes I kind of want to say, well, the way that we actually process like a poem, once we're at the stage where we sort of like unfolded all this sort of like, to use some Kantian terminology, like, phanopoetic and melopoetic and like logopoetic images from it, that we now actually do a kind of like autoencoding like processing on it, and we learn this Lord. So I've been talking about like the geometrical interpretation like it all, and I think actually maybe that's where we need to go. It's basically, okay, so you have a big bunch of like objects which is generated by work of art. Then I want to say it's like what like an autoencoding does is it learns a low dimensional surface, so it's like if like the objects are like spread in some kind of like 1,000 like dimensional or like 10,000 dimensional representation space, assuming that humans use such representation spaces, I think they do. Then you manage to learn through autoencoding a kind of like 5-dimensional hypersurface that connects all these like points. The idea is like, well, if these points didn't have a very strong vibe unity, then you would never be able to like connect these like points through a 5-dimensional surface that isn't insanely curvy. You'd have to have like at least like 500-dimensional, 1,000-dimensional surface. So the idea is that like the vibe unity of like the images, broad sense of image, generated by the work of art is expressed by the fact that the autoencoder like process, or this autoencoder like result of our like processing of this panoply of like images can connect all of them on a hypersurface that is lower dimensional rather than higher dimensional. And it's this surface that is, I guess, like properly speaking, the conceptual, not conceptual isn't the right word, the like imaginative, cognitive, epistemic event or like product itself. And it's rather than sort of like the panoply of like images in the broadest sense generated by the work of art once it's done all this linguistic mischief. Sort of like very efficiently like determines what sort of like the most effective low dimensional hypersurface that connects all of them is. The idea is of like if you just like sample from like the reality that inspired the work of art, there's going to be like a great variety of like different lower dimensional surfaces that would like work, and you'll need like a much larger sample to get like to something that's like determinate. But from like the work of art, there's like sorry, actually I said something actually misleading. The idea is like there's like if you sample from like reality, then no low dimensional surface would like hit all of them exactly, but it will pass near to like all of the points from the samples. Whereas like with the work of art, you can have a lower dimensional surface that passes through all of them exactly, and that makes the difference. Again, so the thing they're talking about is like the work of art is a thing that the autoencoder or the autoencoder like process in our mind can reconstruct exactly rather than approximately. And then sort of like the additional constraint that you get from like trying to reconstruct exactly rather than approximately means that there's going to be like a fairly determinate, low dimensional hypersurface that can do the job. Whereas like the job of like approximating, if that's the best we can do, there are going to be a lot of different surfaces, and only like a very large sample to get sort of like to the intended surface. Sorry, I'm using a lot of like technical terminology they didn't really explain, but hopefully, part of the reason I was drawn to this terminology in the first place is because it's like, I feel like it resonates a lot of tropes that we like in the, the Deleuzians, people like that like intuitively play with like anyway. So I hope that it has some like intuitive resonance, even if not all the, technical like reference points have been well expositioned. Yes, and then.
I'm wondering, I've wondered this for a long time, I want to ask this for a long time, but would it be possible, like if an artwork is like a curation of objects which are a sort of expression of reality, so they have to be kind of meaty, would it be possible then, I guess it's kind of a naive question, but for an artwork to sort of mount an attack on its own status as a form of compression and try and like increase its like power of complexity to the maximum as a form of critique of representation. Like you were saying, like if you sample from reality, you would have many more dimensions. Would it be possible for an artwork to try and do like some very strange form of realism by trying to not compress?
I think this is what pataphysics is. I think this is what pataphysical art, art in the tradition of like Shelley, was mentioned, I think, by multiple people in multiple talks today, right? I think two people reference like Shelley and like pataphysics and the idea of like, like a stuff like, like a science and art of like exceptions rather than rules. So like, I think it's both like, something that was definitely technically makes sense within like the sort of like theoretical models that I'm working with, and something I think that like accounts well to a lot of what like certain kinds of like radical avant-garde literature, especially is when if you want to sort of like talk about the kind of avant-garde literature that's like the furthest away from like the high modernist project, and I think a lot of like the avant-garde literature that will fall like in that rubric is exactly sort of like literature that tries to be like maximally resistant to sort of like compression, or like what it would say like get like a lower dimensional subsumption, or just like literature that tries to sort of like fuck with it in various kind of like targeted ways. Yeah, this is a little bit when I said like like I'm going to be telling stuff like in like the basic story in both like the pejorative and functional sense, where I think a lot of sort of like modes of like resistance to the romantic like ideal of this like constructive like world making could be like productively read through like the technical tropes I'm trying to introduce to ground the this like romantic story, because I think that a lot of the critiques of the romantic story and the forms of resistance to the romantic story I think don't really hang on the romantic story being like false, rather they hang on just of like wanting to push against it and towards like a different kind of thing, or about like or about wanting to shine like a light at exactly it's like failure mode, or it's mode of imperfection, and take like interest like in them. But I want to say that I think like very few ideas within sort of like the critical humanities or like the high church humanities in like in the 20th century and 21st century would actually be better off if the romantic story was just like, as we say in like Hebrew, Bobemaises. If it was just sort of like, how do I say in English Bobemaises? I don't know. Gobbledygook, so British. Okay, if it was like, that's like, I feel like a lot of like modes of like resistance to both like romantic philosophy and like romantic aesthetic practice are like better like explained by like an account of like what like materially grounds the reality or the capacity of the romantic story to actually describe causally materially efficacious cognitive processes, and then like accounting for like ways in which like going against the grain of these like processes, or like pointing exactly to what these processes necessarily like mess up or like destroy, or like the price of these kind of like processes. So I think the story does give us, I hope, sort of like the ground for like accounting like well for its own transformations and critiques and like and negations. Don't have to be come in terms of the story being like technically false, but rather in terms of like the gaps that the process described with the story like live from the viewpoint of all kind of like aesthetic and like moral and political ideals that we might have.
Cool. I think do we have one more question? I was going to jump in just because we're not.
That's the last question because he's been holding this in for a while.
Yeah, but one more. Go on.
No, this is a question that I think is a bit similar to Ben's, but maybe approached in a slightly different way. So I was thinking about the way that you framed the talk with something like, if I approach a text by Richard Stein and I'm sort of fundamentally confused by it, but I'm trying to extract the vibe from it. So I'm thinking of the way the reader approaches an unknown text. And what I understood from your Kantian account of the vibe is a vibe as kind of the rule of a set, or the emblem of a set, or something like that, of the things that are contained in the work. But I'm wondering if I, as a reader, come to this text and I try to understand the vibe without knowing it in advance, so without access to whatever's inside the auto encoder, I guess. it starts to seem to me like a sort of fundamentally inductive approach to the vibe. So I'm getting these pieces of information as I read through the text. I'm sort of trying to backform the vibe that I'm getting from the text, which makes it look to me like a very Humean account of a vibe, if that makes sense, when you approach it from the direction of a reader rather than the text or the author of the text. And then I wonder whether that sort of opens you into a very scientific way of reading. I wonder whether that's something that you're amenable to or something that you would try to reject.
So it's a really interesting question. I would say that like there could be a way to reformulate like, you know, many of my ideas in the spirit is like more Jungian, but the way that I like talk about it is that, you know, you finish reading and you sort of like, you know, have like the, you know, sort of like the complete sort of like, you know, set of like things that was like evoked by the work. And now you're just sort of like, you know, you're trying to like find the mathematical structure, you know, that like best compacts, you know, the totality is too fancy a word here, just like the best like compacts all the stuff that you've like, you know, encountered and like and imagined, and so forth. So, you know, this is like, you know, in Kantian terms, this is what we call like, you know, like a reflective judgment. I don't know if you're like, you know, searching for like a concept searching for the most appropriate concept for some like empirical, some sort of like some empirical encounter, as opposed to sort of like you have already a concept in mind, you're trying to see whether this concept applies or does not apply, right? You're doing sort of a search over like the best possible, again, not concepts, saying concept here is wrong, you know, schema, doing a search of its best possible schemas. Obviously, we haven't gotten into like, you know, what on my account explains the fact that like the schemas like used here, you know, are schemas that do not correspond to concepts, unlike, you know, standard like schemas. Sorry, so what I'm trying to say is one could reframe some of this as like an inductive practice. This is because there are certain equivalences in machine learning between offline learning, when you have the complete set and you're trying to find sort of like the pattern that best matches it, in online learning, where you're continuously making predictions as you get more and more data flowing in. But the way that like I tell the story sort of like focuses on this sort of like, yeah, almost like purely like Platonist question of sort of like, you know, what is the lowest dimensional low curvature hypersurface that passes through every point in the data set created by the workings of the work of art. So I do pose this as like sort of like a purely like mathematical question, but I think that yeah, the question of like, is there like an equivalence here? Could this be made of equivalent to a more sort of like empiricist account where just like we're trying to sort of like guess at how the next thing is going to like fit, or like what kind of thing the next thing is going to be? It's a really interesting question. Thanks. Difficult question. So I feel like there's a lot of the questions here. When I start thinking about them philosophically, my instincts go like one way, but then when I think about sort of like, you know, the technical concept that I'm using and what sort of like, scientific results, scientific practice with like models based on this concept have been like, I'm suddenly drawn into like, oh yeah, I guess habitus comes before vibe, or like, oh yeah, I guess maybe there might be like an equivalence between like, you know, a Platonist or a Kantian, like a Jungian point of view here, if one wants to like, you know, yeah, talk about this in terms of like fitting mathematical function to like sort of object versus predicting the next object in data stream. This is like, by the way, like, I'm like, my mathematical background is actually limited. I picked up like a lot of it, like, you know, through like this work, even though now I do work like in and around like AI. But, you know, Tomer Schlank, my advisor, mathematical advisor, is the person who really encouraged me to pursue this work. You know, he once said it's sort of like that the point where he thinks something could be called mathematical is when like you feel like the formalism starts giving you more than you've explicitly designed it, you know, more than you've explicitly put into it when you designed it. You know, it suddenly starts with like, you know, telling you things that it didn't necessarily want it to tell you, but once it tells it to you, you're like, okay, this actually makes sense in like a larger context. I like what I was telling me, even though it didn't want it to tell me that. So yeah, part of like, it's been very interesting, I think, in my sort of experience trying to work with like a mathematical model that's a little bit more than a metaphor, in the sense like even though the relationship between like mathematical models and what might go on in like the minds of like men, women, and envies is an analogy. The analogy is sort of like devised at like a low enough level that I gain some pretty strong commitments in terms of like, oh, if now the formal model has like this implication, and it's fairly clear what's like the analogous like thing in like, the world would be, I have to like, commit to having like this and that like literary theoretical or philosophical take. And that's for me been like a really interesting experience in trying to do, so kind of like hermeneutic, phenomenological, post-Kantian aesthetic philosophy in a way that uses mathematical or mathematical empirical models more than metaphorically. They suddenly have all these like extra commitments to negotiate with, and it's been very interesting. Thanks so much.
I would ask us, do you have a big date when the book is coming?
I don't know. 12 months to 15 months sounds realistic. 15 months maybe.
Cool, okay.
It's still not quite under contract. I've been like, working with like a wonderful editor for like a long time. It's like a long process to get into the sort of like, signed, sealed, and delivered stage. So I think it'll probably be like written in like 9 months and then like maybe released in like 15.
Nice.
It'll be called probably Big Mood, a Transcendental-Computational Essay on Art.
Amazing. Okay,
Thanks so much.
Half promised to synthesize every single talk that was given today. I'm not going to do that because, and no negative dialectics, isn't it? But I'm going to say that we have a lot of wine. Please come and drink our wine. It's going to be in the other room. If you can come, that'll be lovely. Continue the conversation.
That was really good.
God, time flies by so crazy fast. I'm like a fast speaker, so I don't know, like, I guess like the converter of like words to like mean a thing was really